Thanks, Lil, and thanks to all of you, and thanks to TEDxNovaScotia. I feel very privileged to be here today. When I was in my final year of high school, just up the road at QEH, of course, the talk turned to, what do you do next? And for a lot of us, the answer was university, but university to do what? To study what? And for myself, I ended up here. I studied physics at Dalhousie. A lot of my friends became science majors. We, of course, knew people who were going to pursue something different, some branch of the arts, whether the visual arts or something to do with writing or music or something different. But almost nobody talked about trying to combine any of these things. And certainly, in a formal sense, in the academic setting, there were almost no opportunities to do anything like that. Basically, you had to pick a thing. I mean, you could always pick electives and so on. And I had a lot of fun taking Music 1000, even though I was a physics major. But generally, we were confined to our little spaces. But what I want to talk to you about today, well, actually, there are some interesting places today where these things are coming together. There's kind of some interesting, very fruitful interplay today where these things overlap. In case you're curious about the picture at the bottom, it's a dance production inspired by the work being done at the Large Hadron Collider. And it's actually not the only piece of that kind. There's also an opera, I'm told, inspired by the search for the Higgs boson. So that's very cool. And there's this kind of flourishing, but it's still sort of a niche phenomenon. It's always, it's not quite science. I mean, sometimes there is science that sort of accidentally becomes art. Sometimes there's art inspired by science. There's actually quite a lot of that. But still, it's kind of a niche phenomenon. But today I want to turn back the clock 400 years to look at what I think is a very interesting period in history. This is, of course, the beginning of what we would call modern science. Of course, music and art and writing had been around for some time. Galileo, whom you all know, he's very famous. Galileo is going to be sort of my jumping off point for this. And of course, we teach him to physics students today. We remember him as the father of modern astronomy. A couple of years ago, we celebrated the 400th anniversary of Galileo looking through a telescope at the night sky for the first time. And he's also the father of modern physics, so he's both two crucial branches of science, investigating things like projectile motion and the motion of falling bodies and that sort of thing. Now, you might not know that Galileo had some musical training. That's because his father was a well-known musician and music theorist. His name was Vincenzo Galilei. So we can be pretty sure that Galileo probably was given lessons on the lute, maybe also the guitar, when he was a youngster. The item on the left there is a musical score from Vincenzo Galilei. And of course, there weren't any tape recorders in those days, but there's plenty of them now. So you can go to the store and buy a modern recording of Mr. Galilei Sr.'s his music, Vincenzo's music. So it's very cool that that's survived. And I think it's easy to overlook this connection. Well, why does it matter that Galileo, the scientist, had some musical training? Well, when you're doing physics experiments, timing things is very important. Whether you're rolling a steel ball or a wooden ball down an inclined plane, or whether you're making measurements of a pendulum swinging back and forth. We think he got the idea from watching the chandelier in the cathedral in Pisa gently swinging in the breeze. So you have to time these things very precisely. In those days, there were no accurate clocks or watches, but if you had musical training, you actually had a very good sense of timing, and Galileo wrote that he was able to time things to what would be the equivalent of about 1/10 of a second, which is pretty good. Now, he also was friends with a number of artists, and I think this had an impact on how his science unfolded, in particular, his astronomy. So, the fall of 1609, Galileo aims his telescope. Had just been invented in the Netherlands. No one's really used it to study the night sky in any systematic way. So he aims this new instrument at the sky, starting with the moon, the most obvious thing you would look at. And he sees these features that no one's ever seen before. Craters, mountains. Well, we all know what a mountain looks like on the Earth, but what does a mountain look like as seen, well, basically from a distance of 250,000 miles, and as seen from above, so to speak, at that distance? Now, he was a mathematician, he was a geometer, he understood angles and shadows and angles of reflection and so on. But I think the fact that he knew how artists work, as I say, he was friends with some of them, he knew their methods. So I think this helped him, he has his sketchbook out, he's trying to draw these things that he's seeing. And remember, no one has ever seen them before. We all sort of know, even if you haven't looked through a telescope, you've seen thousands of pictures of the moon in magazines and books and on TV, so you know what you're looking at. But he was seeing these things for the very first time. And I think it helped that he had some exposure to how artists were doing things. These are the famous drawings that he did that were published in his little book, The Starry Messenger, Sidereus Nuncius, sort of publicly announcing these tremendous findings in the spring of 1610. He also used the language of the artists. Among the other things that he looked at was this phenomenon, I guess today we would call it earthshine. It's the fact that when the moon is just 1 or 2 days after new moon, of course the crescent part, the bottom part, is brightly lit by the sun. The dark part is still slightly illuminated, so you can make out some details on the dark part of the moon. Now, today a bright junior high school kid can just tell you what's going on, right? Light from the sun is reflecting off the earth and bouncing onto the dark part of the moon, and that's the source of the illumination. But it was all kind of puzzling back then, and Galileo wrote, "It is found that this secondary light," here using the term that his artist friends were using, this secondary light of the moon, so to speak, is greater when the moon is closer to the sun, that is, in the first day or a couple of days after new moon. He goes on, "This remarkable gleam has afforded no small perplexity to philosophers." So again, today it's really not that hard to explain, but he was trying to figure this stuff out for the first time, and again, using the language, the same language that the artists were using. One of his artist friends was this guy, a man named Chigoli, and we can be pretty sure that he looked through one of Galileo's telescopes, because not long afterward, he was working on his most important commission, the inside of the dome of a church called Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It's a very elaborate scene, a biblical scene inspired by the book of Revelation, a passage that talks about the Virgin Mary, and she's in this kind of celestial setting. So she's actually standing on the moon, and she's surrounded by different shining, glowing things and stars above her head and so on. But this is not just any moon, and this is definitely not the perfect moon described by the ancient Greek philosophers that was supposed to be sort of homogeneous and luminescent and perfectly smooth. This is Galileo's moon. This is a moon with mountains and craters and other imperfections. So even though this is a very devout, pious, religious work of art, Chigoli, whether he realized it or not, was being a science popularizer and was really spreading the word about what Galileo had seen. And in fact, he must have, this painting was begun in 1610, which means he must have started working on it really just within a few months of looking through the telescope. So that's pretty interesting. So I've given you an example of science interacting with art, and I touched on music. I want to bring literature into the picture. And in the case of Galileo, probably the best known example, or the one that's most often cited, is the case of John Milton writing in Paradise Lost. Now, of course, this is a couple of decades later, but it wasn't published until the 1660s. But Milton actually met Galileo, at least he says he does. So when Milton was young, but Galileo was an old man, the two men actually met. Galileo was blind. He was under house arrest at his villa outside Florence. John Milton came for a visit. It would be great to, first of all, I guess you need a time machine, but it would be great to be a fly on the wall and just kind of eavesdrop on that conversation. But it really left its mark on Milton. Now, Paradise Lost, it's a sort of a long epic poem, and it talks about the fall of man and so on, but he's also obsessed with the structure of the solar system and mentions Galileo a total of, 3 references to Galileo, and the third time actually by name, mentioning the glass of Galileo, clearly a reference to this telescope that Galileo had been using. And just to hammer home this point, it's not like he was just name-dropping and mentioning a lot of important people who were alive at the time. Galileo is the only contemporary person mentioned in this very long poem. So that's kind of neat. Now, I've been mentioning important scientists and writers and artists. I haven't said anything about the greatest writer in the English language who was also alive at that time, William Shakespeare. He was born in the same year as Galileo, 1564. That's usually mentioned as kind of an item of trivia and then sort of dismissed. For one thing, people would say, well, by the time Galileo looked through the telescope, it was 1610, so Shakespeare was just about ready to retire. I mean, his career was almost over, so there couldn't really be any connection. I actually don't think that's quite right. If you look closely at Shakespeare's final plays, the so-called late romances, and a few scholars, not many, because most scholars don't work on this, but there's a small number of Shakespeare scholars who have kind of poked around at this and said, yeah, maybe there's some things we can say about the influence of Galileo. But even if we look at Shakespeare's earlier work, there might be a couple of things we can say, and we might want to start by looking at who he might have known, who he might have been influenced by. He didn't travel abroad, so far as we know. But in England, there was a very well-known scientist and astronomer named Thomas Digges. Unfortunately, there's no picture of him. We don't know what he looked like. So I put instead his famous diagram. Thomas Digges was the first person to really popularize Copernicus's theory of the solar system, which had been published a couple of decades earlier, but until this point, nobody was talking about it in England. But he wrote in English about the Copernican system and even drew this kind of remarkable diagram in which the stars extend. He went further than Copernicus. With Copernicus, you've got the planets, everything goes around the sun, and then there's an outer sphere holding the stars, and then that's sort of it. But for Thomas Digges, the stars just keep going. So here's an actual representation of the universe suggestively going out, without end. First time anyone had drawn that. And if we look at Shakespeare's, one of his greatest plays, maybe the greatest play, Hamlet, you find, there are different ways to look at Shakespeare's language, but you see, for example, in Act 2, Scene 2, Hamlet is in kind of a grumpy, whiny mood, as he often is, and he's chatting with his friend, his companion, Rosencrantz, and they're arguing about whether Denmark is like a prison, or maybe it's not like a prison. And he says, well, I'm okay. I could count myself a king of infinite space, were it not that I have bad dreams. Well, maybe, this is all open to interpretation, but maybe Shakespeare was inspired by this idea of infinite space described by his countrymen. I should also mention, not just that Thomas Digges was his countryman, they were neighbors. I don't mean literally next door, but we do know that they lived within a few blocks from each other in North London. In fact, today it would actually just be a couple of hundred yards north of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. So it's very likely that they at least knew each other. I'll just mention Thomas had a son named Leonard. Sorry, no picture of him either. I guess they didn't have time to get their portraits painted. But Leonard went on to become a poet and wrote a little paragraph, a little blurb in praise of Shakespeare. He was basically a fan of Shakespeare, and this little poem, this dedication, was published in the famous First Folio in 1623, this compilation of Shakespeare's plays that was published a few years after Shakespeare's death. So definitely some family connections there. But I also have to mention Tycho Brahe, the most important astronomer over on the continent. He was Danish, and he was the greatest observer to use to work before the invention of the telescope. And he was so good at what he did. We'll get rid of young Leonard there to make room for this possible interaction, such as it may have been between Shakespeare and Tycho Brahe. Tycho was so good at observing the sky that the king of Denmark gave him his own island to build a giant observatory where he could do his work. It's a pretty good gig if you can get it. And you see the island here in the channel separating Denmark and Sweden. I have to go quickly here. And within sight of this island is a great fortress in Danish, Helsingør. The English name would be Elsinore. This was the castle that Shakespeare chose as the setting for Hamlet. And you might ask, all right, well, I don't know, is that important? How much should we spend thinking about that? I'll leave you with this thought. Tycho Brahe, kind of a pompous figure, you see one of his, an engraving that was done that he sent around with some of his astronomical notes to his colleagues, including colleagues in England. Around it are his relatives, the crests of his illustrious family members, two of whom happen to be named Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. So you can think about that. I mean, it's not like a secret. Scholars have pointed to this occasionally, but it's pretty interesting. So I think there's actually more that can be said about, Shakespeare and the cosmos. See me in the spring of 2410. I'm working on a book that's going to explore this a little bit more. So I think there can be really cool interactions between these disciplines, and there certainly have been. I hope I've shown you that in this sort of crucial period 400 years ago, when science was coming into existence, there were actually some very important interactions between these disciplines. I'd love to hear from you guys to continue this conversation, so feel free to send me a note. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Thank you very much.